Nelson Mandela has joined the ancestors. In the last quarter of a century, we have not seen a black man who has done so much for African liberation. Nelson Mandela was born in 1918. He became part of the resistance movement against colonialists who ruled Africa as a segregated state under white control. Mandela joined the African National Congress as a young man, but clearly apartheid was not going to bend to peaceful protest. Mandela and his allies then formed the MK, the armed wing of the ANC. It was his work with the MK that got him branded as a terrorist by the white government, and he had to go underground. In 1962, at age 44, he was arrested for leaving the country without permission and charged with high treason against the white government. Mandela was sentenced to life in prison. He would remain there with his brothers in the MK for the next 27 years. Over those long decades of being a political prisoner, Mandela kept abreast of the events in his country. Young freedom fighters had taken up his cause. The white government in South Africa was beginning to realize that you can arrest a revolutionary, but you can't arrest a revolution. Mandela had become a martyr behind bars, and this made him even more dangerous because now he was a symbol of African resistance. The Afrikaner government tried to coerce him to compromise. They offered him a reduced sentence if only he would renounce armed resistance. Please remember that this is the same white Afrikaner government that used the tactics of the Third Reich and Communist Russia. They would regularly employ assault, mass imprisonment without trial, torture, and murder and assassination against black citizens. But they demand that you deal with them unarmed. Terms like militant do not apply to men like Nelson Mandela. You cannot brutalize, beat, and kill a man and then say he is militant for stopping you from continuing to kill him and his people. Militant would describe the white supremacist government. They found Mandela was not easily bought off. Mandela refused their offers and instead chose to stay in prison and let his unbreakable will fuel the revolution. Soon news of his courageous stand would carry around the world. It would even reach the shores of America and rock its very political foundations. When the question of imposing economic sanctions on the totalitarian white South African government came to the desk of President Ronald Reagan, he came out completely on the side of apartheid. President Reagan repeatedly and publicly stated his support for the white Afrikaner government, and to show the Afrikaners his solid support for them, President Reagan had the U.S. government label Nelson Mandela and the ANC officially as terrorists. Reagan's apartheid-supporting position was backed by then-Congressman Dick Cheney, who would one day become Vice President of the United States. And to this day, Dick Cheney contends that his decision to support the apartheid regime was the right one. In fact, even though apartheid has been abolished for almost a quarter of a century, many members of the resistance movement against it are still on terrorist watch lists. But freedom was in the air. New Jersey Governor Thomas Keane was among the first to level sanctions against South Africa. Other states would soon follow. The call for sanctions rose all the way to the top of the U.S. government, and eventually even Reagan's own Republican Party led the charge to overturn Reagan's decision and to enact sanctions against the white South African government. As U.S. businesses and even U.S. banks began to pull out of South Africa, the world was becoming aware of what Nelson Mandela was fighting against. Even Hollywood acknowledged the problem. The movie Lethal Weapon 2 had Danny Glover and Mel Gibson joining up again. This time, the villains were South African apartheid representatives. Nelson Mandela's fight for freedom had persuaded the American movie industry to make a film about defeating white supremacists from South Africa. In 1989, after being held as a political prisoner by a brutal dictatorial regime for almost 3 decades, the world watched as Nelson Mandela was released from prison. The American right wing would go into convulsions as their worst nightmare, a black-controlled African state, was coming true. Within 2 weeks, Mandela was named deputy president of the ANC. At age 75, Nelson Mandela was democratically elected the president of South Africa. Just 3 decades earlier, he was a prisoner in his homeland. He came out the leader of it, and a shining symbol to Africans around the world that our homeland, the African continent, can and will be ours. It is our birthright. Nelson Mandela did not do it alone, but he is representative of the courage and resolve of all his fellow warriors like Mbeki and Oliver Tambo. Nelson Mandela was not a perfect man, but if the world waited for perfect men, the world would never do anything. We need good men who are willing to live and die for the cause. We live in a world of black men who want to talk. They don't do anything, but they have the unmitigated gall to try to criticize a man who actually sacrificed something, like Nelson Mandela. The bastard sons of welfare mothers are so consumed with ego starvation that they would pretend that they can get on the internet and would stand on the casket of Nelson Mandela and demand that we listen to them instead of someone who has shed blood, sweat, and years for his people. This is why the women mock you and the children ignore you. Our elder teacher, Dr. John Henry Clark, said, "I only debate my equals. All others I teach." Any black man who would try to impugn Nelson Mandela would look plain silly. These whiners aren't even able to liberate the corner store down the street from the Asians, Arabs, and Indians, and yet we're supposed to believe that these internet mama's boys are an authority on how you liberate an entire African continent? Nelson Mandela actually did it. When you become one of his peers, then you have the right to speak. He has done more for the cause of African liberation in one day than any black man, including myself, has done ever since. And this is what we should remember about Nelson Mandela. Liberation for Africa is a journey of 100 steps. Mandela has taken the first 10. It is up to the rest of us to show ourselves worthy of his sacrifices and those of Winnie Mandela, Mbeki, Steve Biko, and all the other freedom fighters who have never given up on the cause of African liberation. We do not need perfect men. We need good men who the enemy cannot frighten with death and who will fight through to the end. Go with the ancestors. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. You have earned your place among the pantheon, and your life will live on as an inspiration to women and men like me that there is something more important than your life and even your freedom, and we must be willing to sacrifice both if we are ever going to regain both. You've shown us that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that it's real, and that it's worth fighting for. Nelson Mandela has liberated the southern part of our homeland. Now, it is our job to liberate the rest of it. Africa for the Africans.